There we go. So we have the two that are data factories. The first data factory is, I believe, the data provider factory model. We're going to skip that for right now. But what it does is allows us to have one code base. Our code doesn't change if we change database providers. So we could switch from SQL Server to using the OLEDB server access, and we wouldn't affect our code at all. So that's really important in the fact that we can make our databases kind of interchangeable. We can switch from one to another very easily if we use a factory type setup like that. Now that term factory comes from the idea of making something a widget type item, like it's repeatable really easily. So one place that the factory term comes from is if you're thinking about the area of gaming, you might have like an enemy factory, right? Just spits out enemies every so often. And so all of the enemies they're basically the same base. They might have a little bit different property settings, but they just keep getting spit out. So that's the idea of a factory, something that we can reproduce easily. And so by making our data provider a factory, we can change it easily. So we're going to skip that one, but let's look at the AutoDataReader. Now in this project, we're going to use an SQL statement, a select statement. When you get this message, just go ahead and have it change the target. Doesn't seem to cause us any trouble with these. So here's our AutoDataReader. It's a console app. So we just want to look at our program.cs and see what we got going on here. You don't see it?
No, when I go to program CS, it wants me to use JetFrames.
You got extracted.
Oh.
So go back to your chapter 21.
No wonder I had it.
Man, it'll be much nicer to you.
Yeah.
Austin, we're just downloading the chapter 1 zip file from the announcements, getting it all extracted. We are in AutoDataReader.
Do I need to download the targeting package or not?
Just whatever that first option was. Okay, so we've got this code here, and let's see. First of all, they mentioned that using static. And you guys, some of you I know have been using that since the beginning of C#1. Some of you may have not been. Review, whenever we say using static, we bring in that namespace, right, as part of our project, so we can eliminate the keyword console, that class name, from its commands. So we can just use WriteLine instead of console.WriteLine, because we have this using static system.console. That makes sense. So nice command. Lets us bring that class into our project, makes it part of our project so that we don't have to keep specifying that class name. So as we go through our code, we're going to see some things like that that might give you questions, because like Alex and I were talking about, the code is a little different from our textbook. So that's kind of neat, kind of challenging for us to take a look. So we've been trying to use the textbook, or I've been trying to, and then it always keeps fighting back. Okay, so whenever we are creating a database connection, we have to establish our connection characteristic. with the information about where our database resides. Maybe you guys can put this one short. And then once we've supplied information to our connection object about where our database resides, we can open our connection, and then we can start using our connection to get data. So we have this little flow chart here. And this is just to kind of help us see what's connected to what. And then we'll create our connection string here together. So our database, up at the top, your database is named your username. So I'm going to put Riley RE up there at the top by not my database, because that's what its name is. Now I'm going to use that information here to build my connection string. If I wanted to, I could collapse everything down and see what kind of methods are in this code. We have 3 methods. We have main and first version and show connection status. So I'm going to look at the main. In our main, we're going to write out this fun with data readers message. Then we're going to use a var type data string. If you remember, the var type could be anything, right? So it's kind of like an object. And we're going to say that we're building this variable using string builder. And the connection string builder is a special object that helps us build a connection string for connecting to a database.
So how come we're using var type instead of SQL connection string builder? I've always looked at var as kind of a last ditch option.
Yeah, and I think that they just are doing that to be consistent with these different items. So could we make it be an SQL connection string builder? We'll try that and see what happens, because that's a really good question. But let's get our connection string built first. Now, our initial catalog is another word for what database do you want to open when you connect. And we want to open our database. So you're going to put your username there. Now, the next thing is our data source. And our data source is our SQL server. How do we connect to that? So that information is on Canvas. And I need to go back to our modules. And it's here in our lesson 9 stuff. What I want is this data source string. So down here in our setup page, this information that says connecting from Visual Studio says our data source should be this stu SQL. So I want to copy that whole string from the equal sign over to the semicolon. I'll copy that and paste it. Now I'm going to paste that inside the double quotes. So this one's a bear. Now remember, we're using that @ sign to say we want this string to be processed as is. So make sure that @ sign is outside of your double quote. You end the string with a double quote and then a comma. Now this morning we found out that we did not really need the connection timeout and the integrated security. So let's change those parameters. If we go back to our instructions here, it says we need our user ID and a password. So if I start typing user ID, I see that the property that's available is user uppercase I, uppercase D. So I'm going to set that equal to my user ID, and it's a string where that other parameter was a number. And then the last thing we need is our password. So if we had integrated security, that would mean that our Windows network security was going to be applicable to our SQL server, and we wouldn't need to pass username and password information because it would grab that information from our Windows login. Since our servers are not set up that way, we have to supply the username and password. So lots of new things looking at this code just in this one line of code, basically, because notice it ends with a semicolon down here. So this is really just one line. We have a var data type. We're using an SQL connection string builder. And notice the way the SQL connection string builder is set up. We could pass parameters to it within a set of opening and closing curly braces. Okay. Now I'm going to keep going and seeing what else we have in our main. Before I do so, I want to update my flow chart. On my flow chart, we have a spot for our connection. So your connection, we have our connection string in CN String Builder. And right here, we're opening our connection. So our connection is named connection. So I'm going to put that on my flow chart. So I'll put the word connection beside it to know that it's named that. But I think that I should also document the fact that it uses this CN string builder for its connection string. So those things are both important in my connection. Now, when we create this connection, again, they're using the var data type instead of the SQL connection data type, which is very interesting. Shows us some different options. But this connection is established within a using clause. The using clause says any resources that are allocated to this process during the using clause will be released when the using clause ends. So the using clause begins with these opening curly braces and ends with this closing set. So anything that we do inside there, like open our connection or open any other objects, all of those things will automatically be closed, and those resources will be released by C# when our using clause ends. So we don't have to manually close them.
You're only dropping the variables that we define inside of that parameter, or just like everything, every bit of code that's defined in here?
Only the things that are within the using. So like up here, we create our connection.
So it'll drop connection and then it'll drop SQL as well.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yeah.
So these are all local variables.
Yes. And they're super local. They're local to the using clause. So in our first using clause, we create our connection. We tell our connection that its connection string is in that string builder. And then we tell the connection to open. Okay? So that's what's going on with our connection. So I could add that to my flow chart. Besides needing that string builder, it needs to run an open method. Now they're using a call to their other method here, show connection status, and they're passing their connection in, so we'll look at that. But now that we have this connection open, we have our arrangement with the database we're communicating. We have made our handshake, we're talking to each other. We're going to establish an SQL command. Notice there's really two SQL commands here. First of all, we're going to select all the columns from our inventory table, all the rows. Then we're going to select all the columns and all the rows from our customers table. We have both of these select statements in this SQL string. Now we have another using statement that says, hey, Now we need to create a command object to process that SQL command. So our command object is going to be called my command. So let's write that down on our flowchart. My command. And the command object does some interesting things. It needs to know what our SQL code is. So I'm going to put that down on my flowchart. It needs our SQL code. And it needs to know what connection to use. So that's how those are tied together. Now we say, okay, database, I have this command. I'm ready to run it. Right here, we execute that SQL command. The results from our SQL command, all of the rows that get returned from the select statement, are going to be placed into our MyDataReader SQL data reader object. So I'm going to write that down on the flowchart. My data adapter or data reader is MyDataReader.
So my command executor is a function that's returning all of the things that follow the.
This function right here, the execute reader method, the execute reader method is going to take your command object that tells you what SQL to run, what connection to use, and it's going to run that SQL command on that connection. The results then will be put into MyDataReader.
Okay.
So all your rows.
This is a function that produces whatever SQL.
Yeah, whatever we want. And we'll step through it with our debugger too so you can see it.
So you can also like create tables, updates, and drop tables all just from C#.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You don't need to do stuff in the other programs.
Yeah, we can do whatever we want.
It's probably easier in the other program now.
Okay, so now we've got our reader and we can just process all of the records, all of the rows that came back in our reader in a while loop. So we're saying, while we can read something from our reader, let's output the fact that this is a new record and then output information about that table row. Now, when we output data about that table row, we're using the get name and the get value methods of our data reader to make it tell us what those columns are and what those values are. And we'll look at the other application that we have where we'll see how we can get that data using the column names. Okay, so if you look at your flowchart, you'll see that you have a lot of pieces and they have to match up with each other properly for us to get to our data. Now, the last two pieces, the data set and the data grid, are things that we use more in forms-based applications. So since this one is a console-based application, we don't have the data set and the data grid. But we know now we start with our database and we have to attach to our database our connection. Then our connection supplies information for our command object. And our command object can be executed to supply us our results in our data reader. So let's set it up in the debugger so we can step through it. First, we want to make sure if we can connect to our database because we put this connection string in here. So let's try just running, seeing what happens. Okay, so I got some stuff. So we should see, if you can scroll up to the very beginning of your output, you should see that initial message, the fun with data readers, and then that info about our connection. It tells us where we're connected, what our database name is, all those kinds of things. And then we start processing our data reader after we've run our SQL command. So we see all of our different cars that we put in our database the other day. And then we start seeing all of our different customers. So let's change that SQL code. What's the matter?
Says login failed for
So this is the one we logged onto the other day when you created the tables.
I have only color on me over there, and I use color on me first.
Because it would be whatever shows up in Canvas. So if it's your employee account, that's the one that I would have used.
Could we have multiple SQL variables that have each in like a complex like SQL command and just swap them out? in
Uh-huh.
Reader?
Yeah.
We don't have, so that way we just like have run through subcommands.
Right. So then I'm putting one
Yeah.
in my actual password.
Use your password.
Okay, that might be it.
Doesn't like my user.
Doesn't like your username?
No.
So it should be your user ID, and then your password should be your user ID without your initials or any leading zeros. Yeah. Password. So your user ID was your username, and then your password was just the number part without leading zeros.
Yeah, that's, I've got it. Yeah, I've got it. It should be without that. You know, my Wi-Fi.
Because the Keller mean right in there. It wouldn't go to your Keller mean and get the numbers. Should be try opening this filter, whatever you want.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I know it's color on me. That's why I started with
Your
it.
data source and your initial catalog.
Yeah, you shouldn't have that one. No, I was zero.
Well, now I was just saying, it doesn't work so long. Well, a second ago, I changed it.
Click stop so that it takes your changes.
That might be the reason why.
So no leading zeros in your password.
It's syncing. Yeah, I tried
Yeah, I got one from that.
Did you create your table? That was really important to get done, so you'll have to go do that.
Do you mean the tables that we did that we have to turn in? Because I did those.
No,
I did.
You're doing a book. Okay, is everybody working? Let's set it up in the debugger.
this one thing.
Hmm?
Oh,
Now, in this program, this first version method is their original main. So you could change it back and forth if you wanted to. Looking at the chapter, they actually start out kind of showing you one thing, like how to use this connection string as just a string. And then they show you how to use the connection string using the connection string builder. So there's really two versions of the main in this program. So we'll get that first version, we'll just keep rolled up, but you can sure refer to it if you want to. So I want to set a breakpoint right here on line 38, the beginning of our main. And then let's double check our debug options, because remember, some of the computers could have been reloaded. Under the debug menu, choose options. And on your general screen, make sure that this step over properties and operators is not checked. We want it open like this. And remember, that's the one that'll, if that's checked, it won't show us execution of our class code. And we want to see that code. So let's start running.
what option did you have?
Sorry, I have to get back in there. I can't remember. Step over properties and operators. Just make sure that one's not checked. Okay, so as we start running then, we should see it halt execution right here at this very first line in our main. I'm going to go ahead and click step into, and now in your console you should see that output, Fun with Data Readers. Now, as I said, this command is really just one command, and notice how the debugger highlights that it's yellow, it's all part of one command. So if we wanted to, we could look at any of these different parameters of the connection string. I'm going to go ahead and tell it to execute that line of code. And now I should be able to back up and double check what I've got. No, debugger's not really letting me. It's letting me play it, doing weird stuff. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I messed it up. Let me try that again. Sort it and run. Okay, so after we've created our connection string, we can see it down here in our locals. I don't know why it's not letting me mouse over our different property values, but if you look down here in your locals window, that connection string object is something that you can check out. Here's our actual string for how to get to our server or data source. Okay, so now we're to our first using statement, and we're telling the system that we want to use a new connection. So let's step into that. So we create our connection in the using statement, new SQL connection, and then we update our connections properties. First of all, the connection string property, to set it to that connection string that we have built. Now you can see it. It's really big. Then if we keep stepping, we should see that connection be open. And then we're going to run our show connection status method. We're passing that method our active connection. So we can pass that connection just like we could pass an integer or anything else. Now we've got all our write line statements. Notice the properties that we're using here of our connection. We did connection.dataSource, and that's outputting that information about how we're connected in our database. So all that valuable information we can get by interrogating our connection properties. Okay, so we ran that method and output all that great information. Now we're going to set up our SQL string so that it's ready. And this morning I told everybody you have to be really careful in your SQL string because it won't tell you if you have any errors. It'll just not work properly. Well, the new release is just mightily awesome and actually does tell you if you have errors in your SQL code, which is a great thing. So I'm going to keep going and we'll try it and I'll show you that. Okay, now we are within our connections using clause, but we're going to start another using. So we have a nested using clause to establish our command object. And we saw from our flowchart that our command object ties our SQL command to our connection so that it knows where to run that command. So that means basically that you could have multiple connections open in this application, right? I could have a connection open to SQL Server. I could have a connection open to Oracle. I could have another connection open to Access. As long as I control which connection I use for what SQL command, I could be gathering data from all those different sources. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and let it build our command. And our final using, we say, okay, take that command and execute it and put its results into my data reader. And then we go into our data reader read routine. For each item in our data reader, we're going to output that heading that it's a new record. And then we're going to write out information about the column and the value. So this first one that I had written out says car ID equals 10,025. And so I see it down here in my locals, but I have to really look, get name and get value. So they're kind of hidden a little bit since they're coming from that data reader object. Now we're going to cycle through our data reader again, write out the next line for that first car. So in this loop, we're just going through each field on the row to write out all of the different fields or columns. So you should be able to see it get through one car, and then we'll go back and read another item from our data reader, and we'll output that new line that says record again. So now we're ready to output all of the fields in a loop for this record. Okay. So you can get all that set up just the way you want it. They start on page 816 is where you've got to start to create those tables. 816. If you don't have them created. Who all needs those tables created? Who all doesn't have them? Just raise your hand if you don't have them. You don't have them? You have them? You created them? The tables?
Yeah.
Okay. Who else? Who else? You don't have them? You don't have them? You got them? You got?
For the cars and stuff.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
You got them created? Okay. Let's bring them up for the people that need them. If you go to your SQL server, it's coming up, but it's on the wrong side of my monitor, so you can't see it. I don't need those files, I don't believe. Now, your connection string for our server is on Canvas, and make sure you go get it because it is different than what you're using if you're in the 250 class. So they are different. I know Mahala's using one in the 250 class also. So another person that's in the morning class got all confused thinking that all these tables had gotten deleted because they were on the other server, and that's really understandable because they look just alike. So remember, you can see CIS250 and CIS151-102. So once you've got it copied and pasted into the login screen, it will stay there, and then you can use it repeatedly. We connected, and then we found our database. And in our database, we created the tables that they want us to create. Now, we're going to help you guys get the tables created, but then there's going to be some other things that you're going to have to go back and do offline so that we can get everybody back to work. So the first table we need to create, right-click on tables and choose New Table. The first one we want to create is inventory. So when you say New Table, it's going to come up with some column settings. I'm going to have to do New Table or it's not going to look right. So we have some specific columns that we need on this inventory table. Pretty easy. We need car ID, and it's going to be our key, so it's got to be an integer, and we can't allow nulls. Now, because that's going to be our primary key, we can right-click on it and say Set Primary Key. Then we need a column that is make, and we want to use the data type NVAR CHAR, so N varchar for 50, and we are going to allow nulls. Then we want color, same thing, N varchar for 50, and allow nulls. And then pet name, and again, N varchar for 50, and we want to allow nulls. Now on the car ID column, there's one more thing we need to do. We want the database to automatically assign this number. So in our column properties down at the bottom, make sure you're clicked on car ID, but we want to scroll down and find identity specification and change identity specification from no to yes. Now to make ours fun, instead of making our identity seed 1, we made it be 10,050, but then it caused us trouble. So you might just leave it at 1, but you'll know that you might have some differences from the rest of us. Okay, then we're ready to save that table. So right click up here on the tab to save table 1, and right here type inventory for your table name. So it only needs those 4 columns.
10,025.
Yeah, it caused us trouble. Okay, so if you've got that one set, I'm going to right click on it. Oh, and remember when you create this table, after you save it, you can close the tab, and to see it over here in this Object Explorer, you might need to click on Tables and click Refresh several times, or hopefully once, and then it should show up. Now I see my inventory table, so I'm going to right click and choose Edit Top 200 Rows, because we want to put some test data in there. And this is the test data we want. You're not going to type in the car ID. You're just going to type in the other 3 fields. Make sure you just press Tab through it. If you click or try to space or use other things, you can make it into quite an ordeal. But if you just tab through the different columns, it'll go pretty quick. So let's set up these rows in our table. I'm doing that same thing. I'm sitting here looking at it going, why does it not have the updates from this morning? Oh yeah, it's a different database server for the two classes. All right, doing okay with that? How's everybody doing? Any more time? You done? Not hearing anything. I'm going to move on. Now we need to create a new query to create another table. So for this one, we're going to do things a little differently so that you know you can. The first thing we're going to do is a use statement to make sure it uses the right database. So make sure you use yours, not mine. And all of you that are all done, good job. And we're going to create a table called customers. So in this example, we're going to use DDL syntax, data definition language, to create our table instead of using that GUI app that we used for our previous table. So for this table, whenever we use square brackets in SQL Server or in SQL, it tells the server to use what's inside the square brackets as an identifier, even if it has like some sort of illegal character. So it's common to put column names inside the square brackets for safety. Now, in our customers table, we're going to have a customer ID, and it's going to be an integer, and it's going to be an identity column, just like our car ID was in the previous table. So in our DDL syntax, we use the keyword identity to specify that. We named it first name, and it's n varchar for 50. Last name. And for this table, we're going to specify that the primary key is clustered, which doesn't mean too much to us at this point, but it's based on the customer ID, and we want it to be ascending. Now, one thing I noticed in our book is that every other place he has a customer ID uses a lowercase d except this table. So I'm going to change this table to use a lowercase d also.
So does clustered mean that it takes less time to find it?
Yes, it's stored in order by that key field, so it's actually saved in the database in that sequence.
So they don't have to like spend an extra 2 seconds finding all the data.
Right. It's quicker to find it. Okay, I've got a red line here because I already have my customers table. So you're going to go ahead and click execute to run this code. And after you do so, you should be able to refresh your tables again and see your customers table. And we need to add some test data to our customers also. So right click on your customers table and choose edit top 200 rows. And this is the data you want to put in, just 4 rows.
How do you, whenever you like, it stops you from making it over again, what was the line that you put before the line you wanted to
Drop
drop?
table. Drop table and then that table name, and then you can just run that again. You got it. Okay. Here's good.
I know, I was like, I want someone to see about people. Like a big weekend with people.
What is up with this?
Okay, now on your right click on your table and add your data. So we just have a few rows here. You got it okay? Yeah, I got it. Put your data in.
I know, I again, what Miss Harlan was here at work.
ended up getting that.
Why is it that I can't find my coolers? Did you say
Okay, our last one is our orders table. So on your SQL server, create a new query again. Use your use statement. We want to create a table named orders this time. And our orders are going to be order ID. Oops. And it's an integer, not null. It's going to be our primary key. And it's an identity column. So the database is going to automatically fill it. Our customer ID. And we know it was an integer and not null. And our car ID. So go ahead and run that, and then you're going to create some test data for your orders table. So let's bring that up. Whoops. Now the car ID, remember you need to use number 1, 2, 3, and 4 if you didn't set your seed value to the 10,025 or whatever you set your seed value to will matter. Now on 822 begins the steps to create the table relationships. So you guys need to come back to those after we've gone through this other application and get those done, but they won't impact anything right now. So I don't want everybody else to wait longer. Okay, we got test data. Everybody got test data? All set? All set? What do you need? What do we do? You okay?
No, it won't let me type in the boxes. I don't know what's going on.
Well, now your order ID is a key that the system is going to generate. So you should click in customer ID.
Okay.
And type that number, and then you should press tab, like I said, to go to the next field.
All right, yeah, it's working now. Sorry.
So those are our orders. Here's our customers. Make sure you've got them. We'll just have the 4. Are we good? You what?
Whenever I try type in my order ID stuff or my order data, it says the data enroll is not committed. There was an error in the .NET SQL client data provider. Add a 0 after. Like add a 0. No. After the 1. Another 0? Yeah. Not yet. Oh, okay.
As long as you guys got it, I'm just gonna go, okay.
But my order ID is starting at 4
Ah,
because I've already.
that's okay. So
But it never got saved again.
these auto identity columns that get set automatically by the database, they won't reset So there isn't any way to make it start back over at 1 other than to drop your table and to create it again. So if you want it to start back over now, it will let you drop it with data in it, because it's just going to wipe out that data.
So what happened to my other?
With your other stuff?
Yeah.
Um,
Because I thought I filled it out.
For
already.
this one, it shouldn't matter because it's the one that's dependent on the other two.
Oh, so like if I were to select rows, it actually wouldn't show anything.
Right.
Okay.
It
so
shouldn't
that's
matter.
that.
It shouldn't matter in that one. Okay, so we're good. Let's look at that other project. Oh, you guys. Too much being sick, huh? All right, so I want to stop looking at this project that we've been looking at. Oh, but before, well, we'll try some errors in this other one that we're going to work on. So let's go back to our zip file that we've extracted with our Chapter 21 projects. And this time, we want to get this AutoDAL, and that stands for Data Access Layer.
Should we terminate the program?
Yeah, stop running it. And you can close it if you want. It's up to you. I don't think we refer to it. But do you remember a couple months ago when we first started with that DLL library, I said we were trying to get to a point where we could be a 3-layer model, where we had code that was our user experience, and code that was our business logic, and code that was our data access. Well, here's our data access layer. So this is pulling out all of the database access to a separate class that we can use to access all of our data. So let's open that project and take a look at it. It's trustworthy. I'm going to say okay. Do you guys get that from Yunnan? I don't know where you're opening it from.
Makes me wonder if you're trustworthy.
I'm too trusting, that's for sure. You have to be pretty trusting to be a teacher or your life sucks. If you don't trust people. Okay, so let's look at our solution here. Looking at Solution Explorer, right off we have 2 projects. So we have our project that's our client. That's the one that we're going to run. It's got our main in it. And then we have this other project that's our data access layer. Now, if you look in that, there are 3 different folders. So here we're trying to separate our source code out so that we can identify where things belong. So in our models folder is our class code. So let's take a look at our car.cs file that they gave us. Not much in this class, is there? I hope your employee has a little bit more than that. But all we've got here are properties. Now, this car class matches up with our inventory table, if you notice in our database. That's kind of unusual. Normally, we would have an inventory class that matches our inventory table. The author just wants to really show us that that's not required. So this is kind of a non-standard arrangement because normally we would have the table name and the class name the same. But we can deal with it. So we have our 4 columns that belong to our inventory. And that's all we have in our models folder. So we can roll that up. What about data operations? There's our data access layer class. This is the majority of the chapters. It's walking you through creating this program. We have a lot going on here. Notice that our namespace is a little different. The folders add a layer to our namespace. So we've got our solution name dot folder name. So that can cause us some trouble if we're not expecting it. Okay, so in our class here, we have a constructor, and it's kind of a weird one. We have a couple of class level variables, our connection string, and whether we actually have a connection, our connection itself. So those are important to us. We're going to be able to access our connection string in any of our methods in this class.
Is there a reason they're starting with underscores?
The book likes to start with underscores, and I'm so glad you asked about that. We have one student in the morning class that does that religiously from the book, and I'm always sending him messages saying, you shouldn't be using these underscores. The last time I sent him like 4 different sources that say don't use underscores in C# variable names. So that is something the author likes. I'm going to leave it up to you guys.
To define that there were local variables, but
He does it to define like properties and different types of things in the class.
it just looks ugly.
It looks ugly, and everything I can find says it's recommended you do not do that.
Can it cause bugs, or is it just for code?
No, just because of, you know, common conventions say to not use the underscores like that in your C# code.
So yeah, so I got Stack Overflow. I was like, I wonder what these underscores are doing. Like, I wonder what they do. I was like, I guess I'll go look at something else.
Did you find anything?
No,
Just
I
don't
didn't.
use
I
them.
just went for a different answer that didn't have underscores.
Isn't
I didn't know what they were.
it weird how that just that one character can really throw us, because we're like, does that mean something? Is it something special? And you're absolutely right to check it that way because it is so unusual. So,
For a long time, if you put an underscore in front of a file name, you're never gonna find it.
because it would just like disappear.
Yeah, DOS did not allow that.
Well, and like underscores will make things sort to the top. So I had a friend who would always put like if a project folder that he was working on, he would put an underscore. Well, after I knew him for several years, you know, if he was doing something, you know how you're watching a friend every once in a while do stuff, and I'd be like, what is that, 8 underscores now you're up to? And he just kept adding another one to try to make it sort up to the top. But
I actually do use that for.
do you? For what?
I have root folders.
Yeah.
So that way I can like keep my folders on top or something.
Mhm.
You just, like, I don't overuse it, obviously, that would just make it pointless. But like if you have a bunch of stuff and you want one thing, it's like say a base class,
Mhm.
to always be on top. It's actually really useful for that. But
No, it's pretty
the
neat.
variable name, I cannot get behind that.
Yeah, I can't get behind it either. And I think it's kind of too confusing when we're working with databases, because database column names often do include underscores. So that would be the only place I would expect to see an underscore is our database column name. So it is confusing. And you guys are absolutely right to make it, to stop and pause and see what is going on there. So good job. And we could get rid of those if we wanted to, but they're not really bothering us. So let's update our connection string. Now, this is another area where there's some really interesting shenanigans going on in this code. Let's take a look here. In the constructor, the primary constructor says that it needs a parameter, that it's inheriting from this, which is this class, right? And that it wants a parameter. And then right here, we see another constructor, an overloaded constructor, that actually takes the parameter connection string and uses it to update our global connection string variable. So this is some interesting code. When we construct an instance of this class, we will do it with no parameters. That constructor will automatically call this constructor that will use this little bit of a lambda expression to set that up. Now, that lambda pointer type thing is taking the place of our opening and closing curly braces. Because we only have one line of code in this method, we're able to eliminate the opening and closing curly braces and use this special lambda character instead. So it's kind of like an if statement where you can eliminate the opening and closing curly braces.
Speaking of which, why are there just 2 random ones below that?
2 what?
There's just those 2 that are chilling out there below the constructor. Do they serve any purpose?
Oh, these 2? These 2 that are hanging out here by themselves, is that? They do, and if you look at it, you can see what they are. This is the opening parenthesis for our parameter. This is the closing parenthesis. So this is the beginning of our method and the end of our method. And I had to look at it for a really long time to see that, because it does look like those curly braces are just hanging out nowhere. But they're all there, so we can figure it out, but it's messy. Okay, so let's get our connection string set up. We know what to do.
The smart thing to do there
Uh-huh.
is put a comment in that says this is a null paragraph.
We could do that on our constructor. It does nothing. Okay, so I'm going to go find that connection string. I could probably not put comments on this code right now because I would have words that would be bad. You try to never do like important things when you're going, what? Okay, so again, I want to copy my connection string, and I want to get from the equal sign to the semicolon without including either. And then I'm going to go back to our data access layer code, and I'm going to put this in. Now, where? Right here. So I want to select from the beginning of that local DB up to the semicolon. And I'm going to put in our data source.
That's interesting.
Now, this is just a string just like any other string. Because mine is getting long, I'm going to close my double quote here after my connection string parameter and put a plus sign so that I can add more on the next line. So let's take a look at that string. Whenever we're working with a connection string, all of the different parameters are separated with semicolons. Our last parameter doesn't have a semicolon. Each parameter has its command and value. Now, what else did we need to change? We didn't use integrated security, so I'll get rid of it. We did use initial catalog, and we set that to our database name, semicolon, user ID equal, and your user ID, and then password equal your password. And yours is different.
User space ID like that?
Do I? Yeah, whenever we're using this string like this, they have a space that string builder did not. And this still might not be exactly correct. I need to go back to the Canvas thing and make sure, oh, the D should be in lowercase. For our string builder, it was in uppercase.
So what's the, what you're on right now is one that wasn't working for me. Like I tried doing this, typing exactly as it was in the book, and no matter what, I cannot get it to work. I still don't know why. Like, I don't even know what the colon this part is doing. It's because I only know that like the parent thing.
Right.
So it's,
We're going to use the debugger and step through it so you can see how it executes it.
Is this like needed, or can we just, or in like the actual field, are we just able to just like use actual constructors? Because I don't see myself being able to actually stop getting a lot of bugs.
Yes, because we could just come up here where we set up that connection string and set it equal to this value. We don't need to be going through all these permutations of stuff. It's just like trying to drive you guys crazy.
So it's different ways of coding, but this is
It's like when you're coming along after Joe Bob the coding cowboy and you got to figure out what in the world he did.
yeah,
Now you know how to do it.
people have to use research code. I don't know why it's
Yeah, this one's interesting. Okay, so let's see what else we've got looking at this interesting code. We see that our constructors are definitely something we want to step through in the debugger to see how that's working. Now remember, this is our data access layer. So every single method in here is going to be concerned with our database connection or getting data from our database or something along those lines. Okay, so our first method after our constructors is open connection, and it just opens a new SQL connection. And then we close our connection. We have a method called getAllInventory that is doing some good work. Let's see what it does. It does a lot. First, it opens the connection. It allocates a list of cars. It sets up its SQL string that it wants to select everything from our inventory table. Then it sets up the SQL command object using that SQL command in our connection. And then it executes our SQL command. Notice it does it a little bit differently, but it still puts the results into a data reader, just like our previous example. So we go into a while loop, and while we can read rows from our reader, we add those rows as car objects to our list. When we're done reading all of the cars from the database, we close the reader and return that list. So this method, getAllInventory, is going to get all of the cars, create car objects for those, and return them all as a list. So that's a meat and potatoes method. It does a lot of work. It's a really good example. Next, we have a method that just gets one car. So it expects a parameter of a car ID. It opens the connection. It sets up a car object. It sets up our SQL string. And in our SQL string, it uses that ID for the where clause. Then it sets up that command and runs it. And then again, it reads through the reader to create a car object. Because we selected a car by ID, we should only have one. So we'll have that one car. We'll return that car back to our caller. Now, the other methods that are here in our code, first we have the method to insert new cars into our inventory. It opens the connection, sets up the SQL, sets up a command, and then it executes the command. Notice it's a little different. It doesn't say execute reader, it says execute non-query, because since this is an insert, it's not going to return any rows. So when we do an update command like that, we use this execute non-query.
Just returns a Boolean to tell you that it did it.
Worked okay.
Kind of neat.
They have some other sample code here for you. And some other ways that you could insert things. So a lot of the code here is examples. Here is the delete method to delete a car from inventory. We could update the car's pet name, find the pet name. Remember when we created our tables, we created that stored procedure in our database that selected the car based on pet name. This method runs that stored procedure. So it gives us a great example of how to run a stored procedure. Mm-hmm.
So instead of using like the SQL string thing, can you just use this procedure?
Yeah, and so a stored procedure is a lot safer because you've already tested that code. You have it saved in the database, so it's not being transmitted across the network where it can be corrupted with SQL injection and things like that. And so stored procedure is always the safest, most recommended way to go. You've already tested it. It's all safe. Okay, so a lot of this code is really good examples, but not necessarily something that you're going to understand right at this moment. Some of you do, some of you don't. That's okay. We're all at different places in our learning curve. And what we want to do is try to get further along. So let's try to run this thing. Let's see if it'll work. Oops. Looking at our Solution Explorer, my main is in this AutoDataReader client project. Let's take a look at it. I wanted to look at it before we ran it anyways. So it just does some stuff. So it actually like just runs some of our methods and does some different things with them and all sorts of weird stuff. Here it deletes a car and, you know, it just tries to do some testing. Has some commented out code even for other things about cars. So it's just great for us to use as a tester. So now I'm going to make this be the default project. Right click on this project and say set as startup project.
So the layers are different projects then?
Well, those are called procedures, there's no name on it.
Mm-hmm. So our AutoDataReader client and AutoDataReader DAL are different.
Yeah, whenever I did this, I think I had those separate solutions.
Oh, so it would be harder for them to find each other. That might be what it is.
Yeah,
Let's run it.
that might be why it was yelling at me about the.
Probably you did really good. Okay, so here's some stuff output from our test run. Oh, and then it crashes. It works for a while. So it gets to the bulk import and it doesn't like that. So let's go to our main and see if we can comment that out. Get all inventory. There it is, this do bulk copy. I'm gonna comment that one out. So we don't have everything set up properly for that. Now, can we run it again? Or is it gonna be mad about some of those things that it's already done the first time? We'll check. That's okay. The do bulk copy in the main. What's the matter? I'll set it up in the debugger and we'll figure out where it's going. Debug it. What's the matter, sir?
I just want to get that
SQL connection.
Do what?
on the method close connection.
Uh-huh.
Is there any reason why those variables aren't
Oh, really good question. Alex, can you explain that a little bit?
What?
In the closed connection, it was the null
The-
things that you're
oh,
talking
the
about.
null comparison operator?
Yeah.
question dot or question mark dot thing, yeah, it checks if it's null first. And if it is, then it returns null, but if it isn't null, then it does the rest of it. So that'll first check if it's null, and then if it's not, it'll also check if it's.
So it's kind of like getting rid of the if statement
Yeah. it's-
beforehand to
it's like
say
additional-
if SQL connection dot is active.
Yeah.
Because the question mark is saying, don't worry about this if it's null.
yeah,
at all,
if it's
kind of
null, throw it
ignore-
out, if not, check this.
So you're very short on the turn area.
No, you go.
Yeah.
Score initial.
He found
I-
it. I
I
can
didn't
find
do
it.
the-
Good, good.
I think it's called a multi-comparison operator, but I'm not sure.
That sounds good to me.
About it was called-
Okay, so let's turn on some debugging here. In our main, we can kind of move around on where we set up our debugging, but let's start out, first of all, on line 17, where we create that data access layer object so that we can see what goes on with those interesting constructors. Did you guys find it? No?
It does not like SQL connection.
Yeah, it's giving them all up.
Oh, it'll take a little while for it to crash.
No, yeah,
It's a problem.
it's saying the underscore SQL connection dot open.
You know, I've played with this a lot of fall.
Yeah. It just does.
Get rid of it. Stop it. You should know that I don't stop it.
Mhm. That's it.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay, so we've got our breakpoint set. Here as we instantiate our data access layer. Let's run it. Now your console should be up, being blank. You're sitting here at this line of code ready to execute it. So I'm going to step into, and we see that first constructor, the colon this. And to me, it's just saying use this parameter to call. So it's like saying call inventory DAL with a string as a parameter, this parameter. Got to find a better explanation, but does that make sense? Because we're saying in this class, use this parameter. So this class is inventory DAL. So we would have to go to that one. So if you step into it, you'll see that happen. And then it goes into that constructor that expects the string and sets up our underscore connection string.
So basically it's saying use this for the connection string.
Yeah, but it's a very interesting way of doing it. Now, if we mouse over our connection string variable, you should see that it's got that value now, that everything was properly set. Now, I'm going to continue on, and we should jump out of our data access layer back to our main. Now, we're going to create a list, and in our list, we're going to run that get all inventory method that's in our data access layer. So in our get all inventory method, we're going to open our connection. We'll set up our connection, open it. We'll be back to our get all inventory. We're going to allocate our list, set up our SQL string. Now we're going to open our command object using our SQL string and our connection. We need both of those things. And we're just setting our command type in our command object. Command type. I'm not exactly sure where that is
It's
in the using statement.
where it says.
Right here.
Is it just telling it this can be text?
Okay. Command type. And we'll find it. Keep going. Let's do our look at our reader here. So we're going to actually execute our reader, and that thing is named data reader. After we execute our commands, we'll be able to read all of the data from our data reader. Now, for every time we read something, we're going to interrogate what we read in our data reader. We're going to search for the column car ID. And when we find that, we're going to set that value into our car ID property of our car. Then we're going to look for the column color. And then when we find it, we'll set that in our property of our car, and make and pet name. So notice these strings have to match our column names exactly if we want to find by column name in that reader. So you should be able to mouse over some variables. We might need to wait until after we execute this line of code. Now here's our car class. You can see all the setters are running as we set those different variables. And this is a syntax that I kind of like. In our previous textbook, never used this syntax at all. So take a look at it. What do we have here? We have our add of our new car. And in our new car, instead of passing in all our properties as parameters, we have an open and closing curly brace where we are specifying our property and then what to set it equal to. So I kind of like things this way. To me, it seems kind of clear. Now we close that curly brace and then close our parameter to our add of our list. So it's kind of doing two things at once. As we read through our reader, we're going to add more cars to our list. And then eventually, when we've got all of our cars, we have a lot of cars. Surely you're the last car. We'll finally close that reader. Now, notice we don't have our data reader within a using clause, so we had to close it manually. If we'd have had that using clause, that would have taken care of it for us. Now, we need to return that list item to our main. Our main now gets it, and we'll go into a for each loop to output all of those items in our list of cars. So again, we're hitting our car class to get those property values. And we should see the list populating on our console as we go through that for each loop. So going through the debugger is super helpful. I'd like to break that select statement so you can see what happens. So that first one we run is the get all inventory. So in your data access layer, inventory DAL, find your get all inventory method. And where it says select star from inventory, let's make inventory be not spelt right. I just took out the E. And let's run this again and see what kind of errors we get. Oops, I don't want to have my breakpoint though. I'm going to get rid of that. Now on my console, I'm not seeing anything, but if I look behind the scenes, I see it's already decided there's a problem. And it says this is an invalid object name, inventory. So it is being able to tell that my table name is invalid. And that is so awesome. So I'm going to fix that.
I'm still in people.
And try again. Okay, so lots for us, lots to learn.
When I did this, I was trying to put that public list car get all inventory thing and inventory DAL. Let's see it for.
Yeah, I just think that you have to, we need something to highlight those spots in the textbook when they talk about going to a different class, because it's not very
They
noticeable.
were doing pretty well about including plastic.
Oh, were they?
Why they did
And
not.
then he quit.
Yeah, just that one specifically. And
All right, let's look at assignments coming up, because I don't want you to stress too much. Now, your employee base, like I said, was due last night. So make sure you get that one done. Don't overdo. It is simple.
Question about that.
Uh-huh.
When you were showing the UML for that, were you wanting it in 4 different tables? That's what I thought you wanted, and it's confusing me. Or were you wanting it in one table?
I don't know. You're going to have to interpret it, because that UML is what came out of the meeting, and that's what you as a developer were given. So you guys are each going to have to determine what you think from that.
We don't have to look exactly at it, break it apart, that we just do what we feel is best. for the
Yes.
student.
Yeah,
Okay, so I
exactly.
regret what I did on. I didn't do what I thought was best.
Well, you can fix it too. You'll have a chance to fix it. So what I'm concerned about is this one that says family table with selection, because right now it's set to be due next Wednesday. And I think that that's an okay due date, but I don't want you guys to feel overwhelmed. And like I said, I know we have a big range of learning. So there's some people that are like, oh, this is a lot, but I've got it. And then there's other people that are like, this is a piece of cake. I know everything that's going on. And I'm concerned about those people that are, oh my God, I'm not going to be able to do this. And, you know, I don't know who you are, because I would think it would be people that hadn't had this equal class at all. But that's just me. Now, we're going to be working with this stuff for a long time. So you are not expected to know everything right now. We've just started learning. So we're going to be spending some time on it. So don't feel like you're expected to know all of those things that application from the textbook is doing right now. We're going to be reviewing all of them a lot. So let's look at this assignment so that you can feel better about it first. In this assignment, you're supposed to create a table in your database for family information. So your table might have things like first name, last name, type of relationship to you. So you could have your brother, your uncle, whatever. And then hometown, age, all of those are just suggestions. Just like we were talking about the employee class, you have more leeway. So whatever you think is important to put in here, put in here. Now you're going to create an application that's going to display the contents of that family table in a data grid. And we want to dock that grid so that it fills the form. So that's a whole nother set of things that we haven't looked at. So let's take a real quick look at it so you can feel really like this is going to be okay. So let's create a new project. And this is going to be a Windows Forms app. And I'm going to call it Car List Test. Because our assignment is family list. I want you to remember this one is a car list. So Yeah, I want to save my changes. Okay, so I have my form here, and I want to use what's called a data source for my form. And my data source is going to be associated with our table. So let's find the data sources window. On your view menu, when you look at your view menu, if you go all the way down to other windows, you should see data sources up here at the top of that other window. And it's also Shift-Alt-D if you're a shortcut key person. Okay, so now we have our data sources window open. Everybody got it? Got one? Got one? You guys find it okay? Now we want to add a new data source. Now the data source that I want is going to be a database. So I'm going to click next. Do I?
Oh, my computer's just freezing. It's the perfect time. Yay, okay, fine.
Stop.
You're forgetting.
It's okay. Okay, so we want a data set. So click next. Now, mine says I already have a connection because I did this morning. Yours doesn't. So let's click new connection. Yours is different, isn't it? Okay, so your data source is going to be Microsoft SQL Server. Oh, there we go. I can get to it. So you want to make sure you pick the SQL Server one, not database file. Database file would be backed up some database to a file. Okay, so SQL Server. Then when you click OK or Next, you should get this information. And we want to use our connection string from Canvas. We're just using that thing all the time, huh?
Yeah, I'm not used to symbol this time. It wants that symbol to go.
Forget what the module was that actually string.
Yeah, week 9, thank you.
Should just
We need, you know what, I'm going to post it to our Discord. Oh, I think I did. No. Okay, it's pinned to the general 102 chat in Discord too, so since we keep having to use it. Okay, we want to change our authentication to SQL Server. Put in your username and password. And then once you've put that in, this drop-down list should populate, so we really know that we've got a good connection. And now we can pick our database. We also have this test connection button down here to test it too, to make sure it's working.
I just froze mine.
You what?
That button just froze.
Broke it? We've got something wrong.
Network related.
Click OK.
Server was not found or was not.
Okay, watch here. And I can show you guys how to get it done. Now I'm going to say yes, include my sensitive data in the string.
Okay, never mind. I just had data source.
Did it finally work?
And connection not responding.
And I'm going to next and finish. Now, if yours isn't working, just watch because we're going to run out of time. And on your tables, it's gone out to the database and it's figured out what tables you have. I want to choose our inventory table. if you expand it, you can see the columns in the inventory table, but I want the whole table. So I'm just going to check that table. I'm going to click finish. And then I'm going to have this data source here in my data sources window. When I look at the data source inventory, I see all the columns. If I do the drop down, I can choose whether I want to see this in a data grid view or details. We're going to choose data grid view. Now I'm going to drag that onto my form.
Are you doing inventory or the whole data set?
The inventory. Now, as soon as I do that, my app is working. If I click start, here's all of my inventory items. This toolbar up here was created automatically for me. I can add new ones,
You know, all this
delete ones,
You've got a complex net code and stuff that you have to deal with this. I'm just.
or
dropping
save
the
my
name.
change. I know. So you can go from super, super, super hard to drag and drop, and now you're done. So that's the way we're going to do our family application. So don't stress about it. I will show you on Monday how to add the selection in so that we can only have certain people so that we can get it working the whole way. But you want to be creating your family table because that's really about the thing that's going to take the time. Where you need to be spending your time this weekend before next week is continuing to look at this chapter in this code and trying to kind of connect all the pieces.
So can we just like do what we did here to just populate the family table, or if we
Yeah,
populate for here?
That's
So-
what we'll do.
So if we populate for here, that's literally just using that code. Thing.
So it's pretty handy, but we'll see that the code is still there behind the scenes that we have to go find when we want to change things or make it do something.
Right, but
different.
this seems like a lot.
So
easier
there's a
to
lot, guys, there's a lot of turmoil. If you look out online, you know, what do people think is the best way to handle database stuff? There's a lot of negative press for these data source objects because when Microsoft first created them, they would leave locks on all of these rows so the data would kind of be held up. But they've changed things so that they can be, you know, connectionless so that when this data is sitting here, it only locks data when we actually go to update and things like that. So there's just different reasons that these have had bad press, the drag and drop stuff. But Microsoft's been working hard on improving that.
So we can update our database.
So we can update. So if we want to add, let's say we want to add another row. I'm going to tab past my car ID. I'll put my Volkswagen. My Volkswagen is red, and its pet name is VW, because I'm really creative like that. Now I need to make this thing a little bigger. So I'm going to go ahead and save that update and close out so I can make my data grid a little bigger.
So you can use this to like make a custom thing so that way you have more control over how you're doing stuff, and more like automated but custom to what you're doing. Like you could have a box at the side that would you just enter a number and automatically converts it based on C, so you don't have to like do math.
Yeah, if you wanted to.
Like, well, I started when 10,025, I need to add that, or you can put a box.
You could. Yeah, so it gives you the ability to start up really quickly and then add those customizations that you need. So I'm going to say that this Beamer is actually a Saab, and I can save my data, and it's all updated. Now, we're out of time, but let's look real fast at our code. It did generate some code for us. So it created a binding navigator. That's the toolbar that it created for us. And in our toolbar, if somebody clicks update, it does this command. It tells the table adapter to update everything in our data set. And when our form loads, it tells it to fill. That's all the code that's in there right now. So we'll look at that next time.
Oh, that's pretty. I didn't get that.
You didn't get that? What do you have? Looking at your form. Let's see. And if you didn't have the SQL class, don't forget there's that Khan Academy course to enroll in.
So is it just like quizzes and videos, or I've never taken the comments?
Yeah, it's real short little videos and stuff. It's really friendly. So it's really a lot better than anything else I have found. I was really excited about it. It didn't used to be there. So that's the kind of that's all. Yeah, I think so. It looks good.
What's weird? Is it a negative? Oh, okay, so you need to do a negative.
Oh, until you update it, because it doesn't have
Yeah.
an ID for you yet.